In this particular discussion of theonomy, I want to talk about sexual morality. And my reason for starting here is that anytime theonomy is discussed, the bulk of objections, at least in my limited experience, have to do with the strict sexual ethics and especially the harsh punishments, especially death, for violations. To understand, even if we still reject the sexual ethics of the biblical law, we at least need to understand what it seeks to achieve. That is, we need to look not just at all the fun stuff we don't get to do, as well as the punishments for enjoying these simple pleasures. We need to look at the law from a civilizational perspective. As we will see shortly, in the giving of the law to the people of Israel, God is creating a culture out of whole cloth, so to speak, and the center of that culture is the tabernacle during the wilderness wandering and the temple in Jerusalem much later. In thinking about the law civilizationally, we need to observe the centrality of the temple and note the incredible amount of social energy required both by the construction of the tabernacle, its maintenance, and the priestly services which take place within it. Chapters 25 through 40 of Exodus are all about the construction of the tabernacle. The book of Leviticus is all about the ministry of the tabernacle, and there's a lot of work to be done in and around the tabernacle, both by priest and layman alike. And because of this centrality, I want to look at the sexual laws we find in Leviticus rather than elsewhere, because those sexual laws are part of the holiness code. God, in the law, is creating a holy people, a holy civilization, a people who are to have a holy culture. And that holiness concerns much more than the ministry of the tabernacle and later the temple. Now, I raise the issue of social energy and connect it with the temple service because there is a connection between the religious devotion of a culture and the social energy it exhibits. With that in mind, I want to draw upon the work of J.D. Unwin, specifically his landmark work, Sex and Culture, published in 1932. I'm doing this because we need to understand a few things about culture and then apply those insights to the role that sexuality plays in the success or failure of a culture. Unwin studied 86 civilizations through 5,000 years of history and found a positive correlation between the cultural achievement of a people and the sexual restraint they observe. On his view, the evidence suggests that human societies are free to choose either, 1, to display great cultural energy, or 2, to enjoy sexual freedom. They cannot do both for more than one generation. And according to Unwin, the whole of human history does not contain a single instance of a group becoming civilized unless it has been absolutely monogamous, nor is there any example of a group retaining its culture after it has adopted less rigorous customs. In his work, Unwin describes 4 types of cultures, or civilizations, from lowest to highest cultural condition, based on the answers to 2 basic questions. First, what powers manifest themselves in the universe? And second, what steps are taken to maintain a right relation with those powers as determined by the rites performed rather than the beliefs articulated? Now, this is because the rituals, not the beliefs, exhibit social energy, the role of which is critical to his thesis. This question about the steps taken to maintain a right relation with those powers can be further broken down according to A, the place where the rites are carried out, and B, the human agency which renders them efficacious, such as the mediation of a priestly class. And the 4 types of cultures from lowest to highest cultural condition are as follows. 1. The Zoistic. Members of such a society do not build temples, neither do they pay any post-funeral attention to their dead, assuming they bothered with funerals in the first place. Examples include the Nez Perce, the Iroquois, Hopi, Zuni, Navajo, Apache, Creek, Natchez, and Pima. The Monistic. Members of this type of society do not build temples, but they do pay some post-funeral attention to the dead, under the belief that having passed on, the dead possess power greater than that of mortals. Third, the Deistic, a term Unwin employs to encompass any form of theism. Now, the members of this type of society erect 1 or more temples in their efforts to maintain a right relation with the powers governing the universe, and the rites are carried out through the agency of priests. For Unwin's purposes, temple is defined as a roofed building other than a grave house in which the power governing the universe manifests itself, specifically erected and maintained in order that a right relation may be preserved with that power. Examples of this sort of culture include the Aztec, the Inca, and the Maya. Fourth, the rationalistic. Members of this society still maintain a right relation with the power governing the universe by means of temple and priestly class, but it also exhibits what Unwin calls productive energy, that is, intellectual and artistic pursuits such as the development of poetry, the dramatic arts, music, the sciences, in short, all those things we normally associate with high culture. And this, usually, after a period of what Unwin calls expansive energy, that is, territorial expansion, conquest, colonization, and the development of wide commerce. Examples of rationalistic societies include Chaldeans, Athenians, Egyptians, Romans, and Western European nations. Unwin focuses on cultic ritual, or the lack thereof, because in his view, I'm quoting now, all of human culture is a reaction to or against the unusual, whether the unusual is personal or impersonal. And that's from section 151 of his book. Now, examples of what he regards as unusual include the following. 1. Any uncommon or impressive natural feature, such as the high places the Israelites were rebuked for offering sacrifices upon. 2. Any unusual occurrence. 3. Any animal of abnormal strength. 4. Any event the nature of which is not understood, such as the birth of twins. 5. Any man of outstanding ability or skill. 6. Anything superlative, such as riches, poverty, excellent wives, neglectful wives, and excessive rain. 7. Good luck, fortune, or chance. Note, Unwin employs the term unusual because he wishes to steer clear of employing the term supernatural. And the reason for that is because the term implies a conception of the natural which these cultures did not have. And when we think about the giving of the law as part of the covenant, it is clear that God is creating a roughly rationalistic culture out of whole cloth. Prior to the entry into the land of Egypt, the children of Abraham were somewhat deistic. I say somewhat because while they did seek to maintain a right relation with their God by offering sacrifices, they did not do so by the agency of a priestly class, and they did so in any location they identified as somehow significant, involving neither a tabernacle nor a temple. One might think of Jacob's offering at the location where he wrestled with the angel of the Lord, recorded in Genesis chapter 32. Now, in the book of Leviticus, without any evolutionary steps, the Israelites have been taken into the desert and had a rationalistic culture created for them, virtually out of whole cloth, complete with a temple and a ministering priestly class. Now, from the title of his work, we understand that Unwin is not interested in describing culture for its own sake, but rather because of the connection between these types of cultures and the sexual restraint they exhibit. In doing the analysis, he found the following. 1. That zoistic societies exhibit no forms of prenuptial chastity and varying degrees of postnuptial chastity. 2. That monistic societies practice limited prenuptial chastity as well as limited postnuptial chastity, along with some form of polygamy. 3. That deistic societies practice prenuptial chastity and much less polygamy or polyamory, though there might be some of both. 4. That rationalistic societies can only be produced by a culture practicing absolute monogamy. There are no exceptions. Now, all of this is why I think that from a cultural and civilizational perspective, it is interesting that following the details about the tabernacle worship, we are going to encounter the first and really only detailed instructions regarding sexual morality, given the connection between social energy and sexual discipline. The cultural motif of the Israelites is bound up in the covenant. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is going to be their God, and they are going to be his people. And in the temple he will dwell, or tabernacle, among them. They will work the land he gives them, and make regular pilgrimages to the temple. Studying the law, we see that in living the life prescribed in it will require the productive and expansive energy we mentioned just a bit ago, energies which will be possible only by severely restricting sexual opportunity, hence the inclusion of sexual prohibitions within instructions regarding the ministry of the temple. Now, to give you a sense of Unwin's argument, I want to read to you a few selected passages to help you, should you ever be interested enough to research the matter for yourself. I will cite the locations for you, which he made very easy by numbering his sections, so the citations will be to sections in the text. Now, I will begin with the discussion which induced Unwin to undertake his study. In regard to the behavior of a single electron, there is said to be an uncertainty principle which makes it impossible to prophesy its next movement, but the behavior of a massive electrons can be prophesied with assurance. Similarly, we cannot prophesy the behavior of any given individual human, but we can estimate the probabilities. If we consider a human society as a whole, we can predict with confidence its future if we are provided with the necessary data. And that's from section 154 of his book. Now here, Unwin quotes Freud, and this is what prompts Unwin's study. Quoting now, "We believe that civilization has been built up by sacrifices in gratification of the primitive impulses, and that it is, to a great extent, forever being recreated as each individual repeats the sacrifice of his instinctive pleasures for the common good. The sexual desires are amongst the most important of the instinctive forces thus utilized. They are in this way sublimated. That is to say, their energy is turned aside from its sexual goal and diverted towards other ends, no longer sexually and socially more valuable." And that's from section 155 of his book. Psychological researches reveal that the placing of a compulsory check upon the sexual impulses, that is, a limitation of sexual opportunity, produces thought, reflection, and energy. The limitation of sexual opportunity must be regarded as the cause of sexual advance. If men and women are sexually free, their sexual desires will receive direct satisfaction. But if the sexual opportunity is limited, the impulses must be checked. Then the repressed desires will be expressed in another form. When the sexual opportunity of a society is reduced almost to a minimum, the resulting social energy produces great accomplishment in human endeavor and civilization. When the compulsory continent of a less rigorous character, lesser energy is displayed, and monistic or deistic behavior is produced. Those are all from section 155. Jung and Bergson consider that social energy cannot be displayed except under conditions of sexual continence. Although I tend to regard a limitation of sexual opportunity as the immediate cause of social energy, I am content to conclude that it is the cause of social energy only in the sense of being an indispensable contributory factor. That is to say, even if other factors are also indispensable and operating, no social energy can be displayed unless the sexual opportunity is limited. Other things being equal, social energy will be exhibited by any society which places a compulsory limitation upon the sexual opportunity of its members. Conversely, in all cases, any extension of sexual opportunity must result in a reduction of social energy. The full effect of an extension of limitation of sexual opportunity is not revealed for at least 3 generations, roughly a century after its adoption. Section 157. I would note that the sexual revolution began in the 1920s. It is now 2022. In the production of social energy, the sexual opportunity of the females is a more important factor than that of the males. That is section 157 as well. Now, moving on, only after the sexual opportunity of the women, prenuptial and postnuptial, has been reduced to a minimum does the sexual opportunity of the female affect the amount of that energy, because, generally speaking, the character of the female has a greater influence than that of the male, for normally an infant spends earliest and most impressionable years in the company and under the influence of the women in his family. The evidence is that postnuptial regulations are not a productive factor unless the society insists upon prenuptial chastity. That's from section 161. When they began to display great sexual energy as opposed to the lesser energy of uncivilized people, human societies were absolutely monogamous. Their energy faded away as soon as a modified monogamy became part of the inherited tradition of the whole society. No group of human beings, however, has ever been able to tolerate a state of absolute monogamy for very long. This is not surprising, for it is an unequal bargain for the women, and in the end they have always been freed from their legal disadvantages. Section 161. The Sumerians, Babylonians, Athenians, Romans, and Teutons began their historical careers in a condition of absolute monogamy. In each case, the women were legal non-entities. After a time, the laws were altered. A woman became a legal entity, the equal of a man. This happened among the Sumerians before they were dominated by the absolutely monogamous Babylonians, then among the latter, just before Babylonia fell under the sway of the Kassites. Section 161. The subsequent loss of social energy after the emancipation of women has been due not to the emancipation itself, but to the extension of sexual opportunity which has always accompanied the emancipation. In human records, there is no instance of female emancipation which has not been accompanied by an extension of sexual opportunity. Section 161. Now, speaking of the effects of Christian monasticism on European society, Unwin writes, "By their voluntary acceptance of compulsory continence, the women who first entered convents proved themselves to have been the very ones who would have bred a generation of energetic sons, and if we examine the records of the events which took place in Western Europe between the 7th and 13th centuries, we find that after accepting and practicing this type of Christianity, a society soon ceased to manifest the same energy as before." That's from section 167. Among the Anglo-Saxons in the 7th centuries and among Normans in the 12th century, every effort was made to encourage the finest women to be barren. In each case, the result can be seen 3 generations later, when the society, or the particular social stratum, failed to produce the leaders and thinkers who would normally have arisen from the ranks of the dominant classes. By the Normans, the despised English were excluded from the religious houses. In the 13th century, the quality of the Norman stock began to decline, that of the English to improve. Section 167. In an absolutely monogamous society, female chastity becomes desirable for its own sake, for after a while the women accept as a point of honor the restraint imposed upon them by their lords. Over his children also a man has complete power. In its full rigor, this institution has never been tolerated for long. Section 168. And that's the end of the passages I want to quote to you. Now, summarizing the argument, the creation of civilizations as we generally know them is the result of high sexual discipline. Until a people harness their sexual energies, they will not build cities or nations, or certainly not empires. There would have been no Rome, period, much less a Roman Empire, had the Romans not sufficiently reduced the sexual opportunities of their society to a minimum. The resulting social energy, which produces great accomplishment in human endeavor and civilization, would not have been available to them, and the same goes for the other civilizations we've mentioned. Which raises the question, if you wanted to destroy a civilization, would you not attempt to loosen its sexual mores? That question for another time, perhaps. Now, with those observations in mind, I want to read a rather insightful letter printed in the Pueblo Chieftain on the 14th of May, 2016, and submitted by Savannah Gonzalez. Quoting now, "This is in regards to the article published on May 4th, U.S. Government to North Carolina, the LBGT law violates civil rights, by Emery P. D'Alessio and Gary D. Robertson. This issue is becoming an uprising situation that is provoking the LGBT community. As I research more into the LGBT, I notice that they are being supported by the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU has been fighting for the LGBT community since 1936. They want, what everybody wants, to be equal. I understand that the religion says that love is supposed to be between a man and a woman and nothing more, but times have changed. We live in the 21st century. Back in the biblical times, when it was supposed to be man and woman, that was a time when we were trying to build the future we have now. But from the old days until now, there is not one thing the same. The world is evolving. We're changing. Everyone is now just trying to find his or her place in this world. We shouldn't hurt those who see love as something more than a man and a woman. Love is what you as an individual feel. The LGBT can't help who they are. They didn't plan to be this way. That's just who they are. They are human beings and deserve to have the same rights as they would if they were normal. This issue with public restrooms is stupid. Gays, lesbians, transgender, and bisexuals have been around a while. They as a community have played by the rule book. They pay taxes just like everybody else does. So now North Carolina wants to discriminate against them? The LGBT community will stand their ground until they are treated as equals as they deserve, and no less. I am in full support of the LGBT community and am rooting for the right outcome. Now, the insightful part of that letter was this. Back in the biblical times, when it was supposed to be man and woman, that was the time when we were trying to build the future we have now. Now, here is a recognition of exactly what Unwin is arguing. We have here an admission that the creation of a civilization requires reduction of sexual opportunity. Well, so much for the insightful part. The rest of her letter argues the case for laxity in sexual matters, the assumption being that the same reduction of sexual opportunity required to create civilization is not also required to maintain civilization. And this is a dangerous assumption, and Unwin's work demonstrates it. It is indeed the case that the same reduction of sexual opportunity required to create a civilization is also required to maintain it. Now, on the subject of limiting sexual opportunity in order to build a civilization, here are the prohibitions recorded in Leviticus chapter 18. It is forbidden to have sex with any close relative, one's mother, one's stepsister, one's sister, one's stepsister, whether father's daughter or mother's daughter, with one's granddaughter, whether son's daughter or daughter's daughter, to have sex with one's stepmother's daughter, to have sex with any aunt, whether father's side paternal aunt or mother's side maternal aunt, to have sex with your uncle's wife, to have sex with your son's wife, i.e. your daughter-in-law. It is an abomination to God to have sex with your brother's wife, to have sex with a mother and her daughter, or with a mother and her granddaughters, to have sex with or marry two sisters, to have sex with a woman during her menstrual period, to have sex with your neighbor's wife, to promote sexual immorality with your children, and to have sex with members of the same sex. It is an abomination to God to have sex with an animal. Now, clearly, we have some serious limitations on sexual opportunity. Now, we might think these precise regulations wouldn't be necessary. Who really wants to have sex with one's mother, grandmothers, aunts, and so forth? And one answer is members of a highly or perhaps extremely sexualized culture would. Another answer is it might interest you to know that one of the tribes Unwin studied permitted such sexual opportunity that virtually any woman of sexual maturity was available to any man of sexual maturity. And if I understand him correctly, the sole exception was a man's mother, possibly even his aunts. Now also recall that several times in the law the Israelites are cautioned not to follow the practices of the Canaanites and others. The last sentence of this text, in Leviticus 18:30, says, "So keep my charge never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord. I am the Lord your God." So, at the very least, the Canaanites were doing these things. Now, moving on, let's consider the role of limiting sexual opportunity as a means of driving civilization, by taking into account the historical or even the military situation at this time in Israel's history. 1. Israel is about to take the Promised Land, which is going to require a larger population than they have following the Exodus. 2. Employing insights we gain from Unwin's work, it is clear that the Israelites are going to require greater sexual discipline than they have practiced heretofore. Or put another way, they are going to require greater sexual discipline than they are recorded to have practiced, say, in the book of Genesis. And the reason is because, as we learned, or speculate based on Unwin's work, that sexual energy will need to be channeled into culture and civilization building work. It also works toward increasing the population because this sort of discipline does not produce, or should not produce, unwanted children. And raising children also has a way of limiting sexual opportunity. Now, in making this case, I want to look at some other sexual and marital regulations in terms of categories which Unwin provides. Unwin defines sexual opportunity as the opportunity which is afforded to a man or woman to gratify a sexual desire. He defines prenuptial chastity as demonstrable prenuptial chastity, where demonstration is by means of tokens, which we'll get to in a moment. Note that for Unwin, any society that does not demand tokens of prenuptial chastity does not truly practice prenuptial chastity. These tokens are the only admissible evidence that a society practiced prenuptial chastity. Note also that postnuptial regulations are not a productive factor unless the society insists on prenuptial chastity, and he covers that in section 161 of his book. Now, according to Unwin, there are 7 classes of sexual regulations. 3 are prenuptial, and 4 are postnuptial. And this is in sections 18 and 19 of his book. Prenuptial regulations. 1. Prenuptial chastity, which is absolute, as evidenced by tokens of virginity. 2. Irregular continence, that is, limited sexual freedom, usually between betrothed. 3. Open sexuality, that is, prenuptial sexual freedom, beginning upon sexual maturity as evidenced by first menstruation. Postnuptial regulations. 4. Modified monogamy, having one spouse at a time, being terminable by either party in accordance with law or custom. 5. Modified polygamy, having more than one wife at a time, wives being free to leave their husbands in accordance with law or custom. 6. Absolute monogamy, having one spouse at a time, but presupposing conditions whereby the wife is legally under the dominion of her husband and must confine her sexual qualities to him under pain of punishment for the whole of her or his life. 7. Absolute polygamy, having more than one wife at a time, these wives being compelled to confine their sexual qualities to their husbands for the whole of their lives. Now, according to Unwin, postnuptial regulations are not productive of civilization unless the society insists on prenuptial chastity, as evidenced by the requirement of tokens of virginity. Now, looking at just a couple of passages in the Bible, I want to make the case that God is moving the Israelites into a cultural condition of absolute monogamy coupled with or strengthened by prenuptial chastity, as Unwin defines the terms, with the intention of creating the tremendous energy required to completely take and dominate the land and to build a holy civilization, a civilization in which people are oriented toward the promised Messiah. Now, the first passage concerning prenuptial chastity is Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 13 to 21. If any man takes a wife and goes into her, and then hates her, and accuses her of misconduct and brings a bad name upon her, saying, I took this woman, and when I came near her, I did not find in her evidence of virginity, then the father of the young woman and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of her virginity to the elders of the city in the gate. And the father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man to marry, and he hates her. And behold, he has accused her of misconduct, saying, I did not find in your daughter evidence of virginity, and yet this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall take and spread the cloak before the elders of the city. Then the elders of that city shall take the man and whip him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, and give it to the father of the young woman, because he has brought a bad name upon a virgin of Israel, and she shall be his wife. He may not divorce her all his days. But if the thing is true, that evidence of virginity was not found in the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of the city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done an outrageous thing in Israel, by whoring in her father's house. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Now I want to make two observations here. First, on the requirement for tokens of virginity. It is often objected that this puts a burden on females that is not placed upon males. Only females must present tokens of virginity. Men, therefore, are able to sow their wild oats with abandon. But if we think this through, and we should, if a woman has to be demonstrably a virgin when she marries, then with whom would any male be having illicit sexual intercourse? The short answer is only with married women, which is prohibited by law and on pain of death. The sexual opportunity for both male and female is subject to the same limitation. Only the means of achieving that end are different. The male libido is kept in check by the relative unavailability of females who must present tokens of virginity. 2, on the subject of the necessity of purging the evil from a civilization's midst, here is the tale of Lotingiro of the Didinga tribe of South Sudan. And this is from Unwin's book, section 157. It's a lengthy paragraph, and I'm going to read it in its entirety because I want to demonstrate how it fits into Unwin's overall argument. So here now is section 157 of Unwin's book. Subtitle, Application of These Conclusions to the Cultural Data. Quoting now. When we apply these principles to the cultural data, two conclusions follow at once. The first is that the full effect of an extension or limitation of sexual opportunity, whether in the whole society or in one of the social strata of society, is not revealed for at least 3 generations, roughly a century, after its adoption. The second is that the production of social energy, the sexual opportunity of the females, is a more important factor than that of the males. The best manner in which I can make the first point is to tell the story of a certain Lotingiro, a member of the Didinga tribe, which occupied an area in southern Sudan and northern Uganda. Lotingiro was a popular young man who from his earliest youth questioned the accepted beliefs of his fellow citizens and openly expressed his doubts concerning the validity of Didinga institutions. His elders disapproved of his ideas, but did not interfere with him. When he was 19, Lotingiro offended against the tribal law. On this occasion, only a lenient punishment was inflicted, for he was popular and his offense was judged to have been involuntary. When, however, he proceeded to offend again, and of deliberate purpose, he was executed. I do not know if Lotingiro's skepticism was the result of white influence. I am ready to believe that it was the product of his own unaided reason. The point I wish to make is that if the Didinga elders had applied the power of their reason to their existing institutions, they would not have executed Lotingiro, they would have hailed him as a prophet. They acted as they did because, like all human beings, they regarded their own peculiar beliefs as right, proper, and true, and they feared that, if their institutions were abolished, they would no longer be in a right relation with the power or powers in the universe. Now let us suppose that all the members of the Didinga tribe had been subjected to a limitation of sexual opportunity. Other things being equal, this, as we have seen, would have stimulated or intensified the power of their thought. We may suppose, then, that Lotingiro's opinions would have been accorded a different reception. The tribal elders might have consented to hear them discussed, but they would scarcely have adopted them, for their minds would be dominated by unconscious elements which had been formed during the days of their childhood. The younger generations, however, would not have been subjected to precisely the same influence, so in all probability they would have been prepared to adopt some of the young rebels' suggestions. At the same time, their acceptance would not have been complete, for they would have been unable to free themselves from the influence of their childish experiences, the nature of which had been determined by the culture of the preceding generation. It would not have been until their grandchildren had been born that the influence of the pre-Lotingiro tradition would have been dispelled. I have already suggested paragraph 150. that a cultural change can never occur unless a number of citizens have given to the innovation the same thought and consideration as produced it. Now we can see the psychological reason. The attitude of society in general, or of an individual in particular, is governed by the nature of the inherited tradition, that is to say, by the nature of the influences which surround a child from the day of its birth. The emotional experiences of childhood leave an unavoidable mark on subsequent disposition, and the reception which a society or an individual accords to any action or idea is affected by them. But the nature of the inherited tradition depends upon that of the previous generation, which, in its turn, is influenced by that of the previous generation, and so on. On the strength of the psychological evidence, we must assert the indubitable power of this inherited tradition. Thus, logical reasoning compels us to conclude that in the chance conditions of the past, it has taken at least 3 generations, or roughly a century, before a complete change could be effected. Needless to say, in the course of these 100 years, much seed falls by the wayside. Not all, but only a few citizens accept and pass on the new tradition. Thus, when a cultural change occurs haphazardly, either upward or downward, there remain some representatives of the higher or lower culture, these increasing or decreasing in number according to the behavior of subsequent generations. The factors responsible for the present condition of any society or of any group within the society came into operation 100 years ago. Conversely, any limitation or extension of sexual opportunity will not produce its full effect until 100 years have passed. I do not understand how the human reason can escape these conclusions. I am aware that just as there exists a fond hope that an individual may be a fresh addition of the creative forces competent to develop on his own lines, freed from the influence of the tradition in which he spent his earliest childhood, so there is a temperamental rebellion against the idea that the sins of parents are visited on their children. I will even confess that in the riotous optimism of extreme youth I shared these convictions. Now, however, I am persuaded that no rebellion could be more foolish or irrational. It is a cold fact that the mind of any adult human being is the product of many mysterious forces, not the least powerful of these forces being the behavior of his parents in the days of his childhood. Since this is so, it follows that generally speaking the character of the female has a greater influence than that of the male, for normally an infant spends his earliest and most impressionable years in the company and under the influence of his womenfolk. In the preceding chapters we have seen that the coincident cultural facts support this conclusion. Both these facts must be carefully borne in mind when the conclusions of this treatise are applied to any civilized society. In the records of history, the full effect of any extension or limitation of sexual opportunity is visible in the succeeding century, while the varying sexual opportunity of the women explains the variety which has existed in the intensity of the social energy displayed by different civilized societies. Only after the sexual opportunity of the women, prenuptial and postnuptial, has been reduced to a minimum, does the sexual opportunity of the men affect the amount of that energy. End quote. Let's observe a few things here. That if a society won't control itself sexually, it will eventually die. Now, the second set of passages on the regulation of polygamy is Exodus chapter 21, verses 7 through 12. If a man has 2 wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him children, and if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn, but he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all he has, for he is the first fruits of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Now let's observe a few things about those passages. What we have here is a modified polygamy, and God does not out and out summarily prohibit it. We can really only speculate as to why. Most immediately, however, is that the Israelites are coming out of a nation which practiced most, if not all, of the sexual acts God is prohibiting here, including polygamy. So there are polygamous marriages already extant at this time in history. And second, God does impose burdens upon polygamy which make it not the idyllic practice that most polygamous males might be looking for. The polygamous marriage God is permitting is no paradise. The polygamous male is going to be very busy, working hard enough to give all of his wives equal provision, including provision for their sexual needs. Neither wife is to be reduced in stature to mistress. The word wife means something, and if a man takes 2 wives, then wife is going to mean the same thing in each case. And briefly, he's not permitted to play favorites in the provision for any of his wives' sexual needs. Any of their needs. 3, but why not just prohibit it? Leave the polygamous marriages as they are, grandfather them in, so to speak. One practical reason is an acknowledgement that it may not always be feasible to prohibit polygamy. On occasion, a civilization may experience a demographic shift, say, after a war, in which there are more women of marriage and childbearing years than there are men to marry them, thus depriving them of the joy of motherhood. And fourth, as a bottom line, God, one might say, is initiating a sexual revolution, or looking at it from our perspective, a sexual counter-revolution. But he doesn't have the 100 years which Unwin thinks is necessary for the successful completion of a sexual revolution. He has 40 years from the giving of the law. And the third set of passages concerning seduction are from Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 through 17, and Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29. First, Exodus 22, 16 through 17. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. And now Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Now let's observe here that, construing and interpreting these legal provisions together, we have another regulation encouraging sexual discipline. And this passage makes the indulgence of sexual opportunity, even prior to marriage, a rather costly business. And especially the second passage, which requires a man who takes a woman's virginity to marry her and protects her from divorce, as my understanding is, for any reason except adultery. And these provisions require a man to think about the cost, especially lifelong marriage to a woman who, despite any physical attraction, might turn out to be a real shrew. Now, on this subject, there was a relatively popular song in the 1970s performed by the late Meatloaf. It's called Paradise by the Dashboard Light. I just want to illustrate the point that I'm making here by reading the last lines of that song. And basically what you have going on here in the song is a makeout session which the male is trying to turn into, sexual intercourse. Reading from the song now. I couldn't take it any longer, Lord, I was crazed. And when the feeling came upon me like a tidal wave, I started swearing to my God and on my mother's grave that I would love you to the end of time. I swore I'd love you to the end of time. So now I'm praying for the end of time to hurry up and arrive, because if I got to spend another minute with you, I don't think that I can really survive. I'll never break my promise or forget my vow, but God only knows what I can do right now. I'm praying for the end of time. It's all that I can do. Praying for the end of time so I can end my time with you. Excuse me. The high price to be paid for seduction, by males to be precise, is yet another way God seeks to reduce sexual opportunity and to channel sexual energy into more culturally productive activities, beginning with the creation of families. As we study the sexual regulations in the law, we should find that there's much more going on than creating hoops for people to jump through, especially if there are those who wish to teach that because of Christ's fulfillment of the law, people no longer have to jump through those hoops. Understanding how civilizations grow and succeed, we should see that what God is doing is instilling in His people the discipline, beginning with sexual discipline, that they will need in order to take and keep the promised land. He has also tied that discipline to Himself by first providing for the maintenance of a holy relationship with Him through the temple and its ministry. On this note, that is, building and maintaining a civilization, Unwin points out that in an ethnically or otherwise diverse civilization, no matter the total population, the group, even if it's a minority, that will actually control things is that group which reduces sexual opportunity to the lowest possible level by practicing absolute monogamy. But why the death penalty for so many of these sexual offenses, especially, for example, homosexual intercourse? In the law, the death penalty indicates that the offense has life or death implications. As I believe we've seen, as I believe Unwin's work aptly demonstrates, sexuality has precisely such consequences, that is, life or death consequences, for an entire civilization. It takes great discipline to build civilizations. It also takes great sexual discipline to maintain civilizations. And by great sexual discipline, we mean the restriction of sexual opportunity to strict monogamy, which, in turn, is turned in the direction of marriage and family. The sexual practices punishable by death are destructive of civilizations, especially by virtue of expanding sexual opportunities, which is not turned in the direction of marriage and family and turns away from the activities which build and maintain civilization. And because these practices result in death on a civilizational level, they are punishable by death. In short, sexuality has life or death consequences for civilization. As I several times explained to my daughter when she was growing up, and would have my son if I'd had one, guard your sexual purity and, when the time comes, your marriage, as if the future of civilization depends upon it, because it does. And the question which now arises is, how should such sins be censured in Christendom? Ought they to be punishable by death? Now, thinking of the definition of Christendom, which I have adopted from John Strickland, that is, it's a civilization with a supporting culture that, under the influence of traditional Christianity, orients its members toward the kingdom of heaven. If we are to talk meaningfully of Christendom as a civilization, then we do have somehow to insist on a severe sexual discipline, a discipline which includes prenuptial chastity, whether we employ tokens of virginity or not, as well as absolute monogamy. And this necessarily entails some means of enforcement which result in paying a high price for non-compliance. I don't think this episode, I don't think this episode is the place for such details as I might have in mind, so I will limit myself to the question at hand, which is the death penalty for sexual offenses. Now, if we accept the definition of Christendom I'm employing, then one argument for imposing the death penalty for sexual violations is the pedagogical role of the law. Fundamentally, Christendom orients us to the kingdom of heaven. It orients us to Christ. The pedagogical role of the law is to lead us to Christ. My confessional standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith, together with the larger and shorter catechisms, teach that the law is useful in the following ways. For Christians, as a rule of life, it informs us of our duty to God. It directs and binds us to walk accordingly. It shows us the sinful pollutions of our nature, our hearts, and our lives. And as we examine ourselves in terms of the law, we might come to further conviction of our sins and of our need for Christ and the perfection of His obedience. And second, for non-Christians, it can be of use in restraining corruption, in that it forbids sin and serves to show what their sins deserve, and what afflictions in this life they can expect for those sins, although freed from the curse thereof threatened in the law. But also the promises in the law reveal God's approval of disobedience, or rather God's approval of obedience, and the blessings that can be expected for obedience. Now, theonomists will say that since the law includes the punishments, in order for it to have these benefits on a societal scale, the punishments must be imposed as we find them in the law. But those of us who disagree argue that the logic of the confession here actually resists the imposition of the punishments. First, according to the instructions here, it's Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 19, by the way, the law we are talking about is the moral law, summarized in the Ten Commandments, which do not include any punishments at all for any of the offenses. And second, these instructions refer also to the judicial laws given to the people of Israel and inform us that these laws expired along with the state of Israel and no longer obligate anyone further than the general equity. And when it comes to criminal law, equity isn't really an applicable concept. Punishments aren't equitable. And third, and finally, one thing that needs to be accounted for is that the Israelites agreed to be bound by the covenant stipulations, which stipulations were mediated by the prophet and lawgiver, Moses. They bound themselves and their descendants to the covenant. Let me read the relevant portion of Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 8. Quoting now, "In the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out from the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, This is what you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded them. Then all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord." Now this, to some of us, is a great problem when it comes to theonomy. Theonomists see objections as asserting that God needs permission to establish His law over them. But that's a caricature of our position. The argument is not that the Israelites gave their permission, but that they agreed to the terms of the covenant in keeping with the manner in which covenants were entered into in the ancient Near East. These specific provisions of the law that theonomists wish to establish are part of a covenant which God has not offered to the general populations of the nature of the world. That should be general populations of the nations of the world. Whatever bodies of law may be enacted in a reclaimed Christendom, it shouldn't be a copy and paste theonomy. Now, in my next episode, I'll lay out in broad strokes my conception of the philosophy of law, which, on my view, is most consistent with the goal of Christendom, which is to point people to the kingdom of heaven. Thank you for listening.